The piano in the Gilded Cage Saloon used to play melodies of lonely cattle drives and vast, starry nights. Now, it hammered out a frantic, pounding rhythm that matched the relentless clang of steel on steel echoing from the edge of town. The railroad had reached Redemption Creek 6 months ago, and its long, dark shadow fell over everything. The air, once thick with the familiar scents of trail dust, leather, and brewing coffee, now choked on coal smoke, cheap whiskey, and the metallic odor of money spent with brute force. This was a new era, and it felt less like progress and more like an invasion. From her post behind the polished bar, Ilera traced the condensation on a beer mug, her smile a carefully constructed shield. She had learned to see everything while appearing to see nothing. She watched the railroad men, their faces scorched by the sun and hardened by labor, throw silver dollars onto the tables as if they were pebbles. They weren't like the cowboys or prospectors who'd wander in, men with stories in their eyes and little else in their pockets. These new men carried the weight and arrogance of the Union Pacific Railroad behind them, and they acted as if they owned every floorboard, every bottle, and every woman in the room. Maeve, her face a mask of weary cynicism, sidled up to Ilera at the bar. "He's back," she murmured, her voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the air. Her eyes flickered toward the entrance. Ilera didn't need to ask who. As if summoned, the saloon's swinging doors burst open, and Silas, the hammer, Kane stood framed against the dying purple of the dusk. He wasn't a particularly large man, but his presence seemed to suck the air from the room, his stillness a vortex of raw power. The piano faltered. The raucous laughter died in the throats of his own men. All eyes turned to him. He wore a tailored wool coat, a stark contrast to the sweat-stained clothes of his crew, but his hands were scarred and calloused, looking as if they could crush rock or bone. His eyes, small and dark like beads of oil, scanned the saloon not with curiosity, but with the cold assessment of a man taking inventory of his property. Bartholomew, the saloon's owner, scurried forward, a greasy, obsequious smile plastered on his face. "Mr. Kane, a distinct honor. Your usual table is ready." Kane's gaze swept past him without acknowledgement. It landed on Lily, the newest girl, barely 17, and with eyes that still held the ghost of the cornflower blue Iowa sky she'd left behind. She was polishing glasses in a corner, her movements small and precise, a futile attempt to make herself invisible. It didn't work. A slow, predatory smile spread across Kane's lips. He pointed a thick finger at her. "Her. I need a private word." A cold dread coiled in Ilera's stomach. She knew what a private word with Kane meant. It was a contract, signed not with ink but with fear. A deal that offered a pittance of security in exchange for a woman's soul. Lily froze, the glass slipping from her trembling hand and shattering on the sawdust-covered floor. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the suffocating silence. Bartholomew wrung his hands, his shifty eyes darting between Kane's unyielding stare and Lily's terrified face. His greed had won its nightly battle with his conscience. "Of course, Mr. Kane, right this way." "Lily, dear," he cooed, his voice slick with false comfort. "Mr. Kane is a very important man. You'll want to hear what he has to say." He was practically pushing her toward the door of the small back office, his words a flimsy veil for the ugly transaction taking place. Ilera caught Maeve's eye across the room. The look that passed between them was one of shared, bitter knowledge. There was no defiance, not here, not now, only the grim acceptance of their gilded cage. As the office door clicked shut, the piano player, taking his cue, struck up a frantic, impossibly cheerful ragtime tune. The noise and laughter returned, louder and more forced than before, a desperate wall of sound meant to drown out the silence behind the closed door. But Ilera could still hear it. She could hear the sound of another lock turning, another life being railroaded into ruin. The distant train whistle, once a symbol of hope, now sounded like the shriek of a closing trap. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Each tick of the grandfather clock in Bartholomew's office, a hammer blow against the saloon's forced cheer. Ilera kept her eyes fixed on the backroom door, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. When the door finally opened, It wasn't with a bang or a shout, but a quiet, dreadful click. Sila's cane emerged first, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. He adjusted his waistcoat, his gaze sweeping over the room as if claiming ownership of everything and everyone in it. He gave Bartholomew a curt, dismissive nod before striding toward the exit, his men falling into step behind him like loyal hounds. Then, Lily appeared in the doorway. The vibrant, hopeful girl who had walked in was gone. In her place stood a hollowed-out version, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide and vacant, staring at a point on the far wall that no one else could see. She walked stiffly, mechanically, back to her station at the end of the bar, her movements devoid of their earlier grace. She didn't cry or tremble, her stillness was far more terrifying. It was the quiet of a creature that had learned the futility of struggle. Maeve caught Alara's eye, her expression grim. "Don't," she mouthed silently, a clear warning against intervention. But Alara couldn't just stand by. After the last of the railroad crew had gone and a semblance of the saloon's usual rhythm returned, she approached Lily. "Lily." She began softly, placing a hand gently on her arm. Lily flinched as if burned, pulling away sharply. "Don't touch me," she whispered, her voice brittle. Her eyes, finally meeting Alara's, were filled not with a plea for help, but with a chilling, profound fear. "Just leave me be, please." Alara recoiled, the rejection a physical blow. She saw the invisible walls Lily was building around herself, walls built of shame and Cain's unspoken threats. To press further would only cause more pain. Defeated, Alara retreated, the weight of her helplessness heavier than ever. Lily was alone, trapped in a secret that was slowly poisoning her from the inside. The following evening, Cain's control was demonstrated with chilling precision. A younger girl, Clara, known for her fiery spirit, was serving a particularly boorish railroad worker who wouldn't keep his hands to himself. After a final, brazen grope, Clara's patience snapped. With a sharp gasp, she accidentally upended her tray, dousing the man's trousers in cheap whiskey. For a moment, a stunned silence fell over the saloon. The man lunged to his feet, his face purple with rage, but before he could lay a hand on her, Cain's voice cut through the air, low and cold as a winter wind. "That's enough." He didn't even look at his own man. His eyes were fixed on Clara, who stood frozen, her fleeting defiance draining away to be replaced by terror. Cain walked over, his steps measured and deliberate. He calmly surveyed the mess, then looked at Bartholomew, who was already scurrying over. "Your girl is clumsy, Bartholomew," Cain said, his tone deceptively mild. "She has damaged this gentleman's attire and wasted your liquor." He then turned his cold gaze back to Clara. "You will apologize to him, and you will work the next 2 weeks without pay to cover the damages." Clara's jaw dropped. 2 weeks, but that was... "Are you questioning me?" Cain's voice dropped even lower, and the threat within it was unmistakable. Clara paled and shook her head, muttering a barely audible apology to the smug railroad man. Bartholomew wrung his hands but said nothing. The message was clear to every woman in the room. There would be no accidents, no defiance, no resistance of any kind. The price was too high. Alara watched it all, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a burgeoning, simmering rage. This wasn't a saloon anymore. It was a prison, and Sila's Cain was the warden. The days following Clara's public shaming bled into one another, each thick with a heavy, unspoken dread. The gilded cage, once a place of raucous if weary life, now felt like a tomb with music. The piano player's tunes sounded hollow. The laughter of the railroad men was a harsh, grating sound against the silence of the women who served them. Alara moved through it all like a phantom, her smile a carefully constructed mask, her eyes missing nothing. Clara's punishment had been a brutal lesson, and Lily's haunted, vacant stare was a constant, chilling reminder of the cost of Cain's favor. Alara understood now. Head-on confrontation was suicide. Pity was useless. Hope, in its raw and unfiltered form, was a liability. What she needed was a weapon, and in a world where she had no gun, no money, and no power, the only weapon available was knowledge. So she began to watch Sila's Cain. Not with defiance, but with the quiet, methodical focus of a predator studying its prey. She learned the rhythm of his days. He arrived at the saloon just after sundown, always taking the same corner table that gave him a clear view of the entire room, his back to the wall. He drank whiskey, neat, and demanded the bottle be left on his table, a small declaration of his dominance. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it never reached his cold, slate-gray eyes. Alara observed his interactions. He spoke little to his own men, issuing commands with a slight nod or a sharp gesture. With Bartholomew, the saloon owner, he was dismissive, treating him as little more than a servant. It was in these small moments that Alara began to see the cracks in his armor. He had a habit of rubbing a worn silver ring on his pinky finger when he was agitated, a barely perceptible motion. He also had a particular aversion to being approached from his left side, flinching almost imperceptibly if someone did. One evening, while clearing glasses from a nearby table, she saw him pull a folded, creased letter from his inner coat pocket. He didn't read it, but simply held it for a moment, his thumb tracing the worn edges before tucking it away. It was a flicker of something other than raw power, a glimpse of a past, a worry, a connection to somewhere beyond Redemption Creek. It was the first truly human thing she had seen him do. Later that night, the crowd thinned and a fragile quiet settled over the room. Alara found Maeve by the back stairs, polishing glasses with a mechanical, exhausted rhythm. For days, they had barely spoken, their conversations reduced to tired pleasantries, both afraid of who might be listening. "He's predictable," Alara said softly, her voice barely a whisper, not even looking at Maeve. Maeve didn't stop her polishing, but her hands paused for a fraction of a second. "Most men with power are. They think it makes them safe." "He always keeps his back to the wall," Alara continued, stacking a clean glass. "And he doesn't like surprises from his left." Maeve finally looked up, her tired eyes meeting Alara's in the dim light. A flicker of understanding passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the game Alara was now playing. "Heard one of his men say they're blasting a new tunnel through the ridge next week. Says Kane's been on edge about it. The last one had a collapse." It was a small offering, a piece of information freely given, but it was everything. It was the first stone laid in a foundation of quiet rebellion. Maeve was with her. She wasn't alone. Alara gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Good to know," she murmured, turning to go back to the main room. As she walked away, she felt a sliver of something she hadn't felt since the railroad came to town. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something harder, colder, and far more useful: purpose. The gilded cage had its own rhythm, a nightly pulse of clinking glasses, gruff laughter, and the tired shuffle of boots on worn floorboards. For Alara and Maeve, it had become the rhythm of their hunt. They moved through the smoky haze not just as saloon girls, but as collectors of whispers and stolen glances. Their alliance, forged in a shared look, now operated in a silent, intricate dance around the boisterous railroad men and their volatile foreman. Maeve was a natural. With a practiced smile and a deft hand for refilling a whiskey glass, she could linger by a table, her ears tuned to conversations about blasting schedules and geological surveys. Alara, quieter and more watchful, played her part by clearing tables, her eyes catching the flickers of emotion that crossed men's faces when they spoke of their work, of the pressure from the company, of Kane. One evening, a group of engineers, their faces smudged with dust and sweat, were speaking in low, frustrated tones. Maeve, while pouring another round, caught the key phrases. "Unstable shale," one muttered, tracing a line on the table with a wet finger. "Told him it was a risk. Kane won't listen. Pushing us too hard, too fast." Later, as Alara replaced a sputtering candle near their table, she heard another add, "He's got the investors breathing down his neck. One more delay and he's done for." The words hung in the air, heavy and potent. It was more than just a job for Kane. It was his reputation, his entire authority, balanced on a knife's edge of rock and dynamite. Their shared knowledge grew in fragments, pieced together in fleeting moments in the narrow hallway by the kitchen or through a discreet nod across the crowded room. But the letter remained Alara's fixation. It was the one piece of cane that didn't belong to the railroad. One night, she saw her chance. Kane sat alone at his usual corner table, a half-empty bottle before him, staring at the railroad blueprints with a thunderous expression. He seemed more on edge than usual, his jaw tight. He reached into his coat, his fingers fumbling for a moment before pulling out the worn, creased envelope. He didn't open it this time. He just held it, his thumb tracing the edges as if the very texture was a memory. His hard facade seemed to soften, the cruel lines around his eyes easing into something that looked unnervingly like pain. It was a crack in the armor, and Alara knew she had to get closer. Taking a deep breath, she picked up a tray with a pitcher of water. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she walked towards his table, her steps measured and deliberate. "More water, Mr. Kane?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. As she reached to fill his glass, she feigned a stumble, her hand jerking forward and sending a cascade of water across the blueprints. "Oh, goodness, I'm so sorry," she gasped, her apology sounding convincingly panicked. Kane shot to his feet, a curse roaring from his lips. "You clumsy fool!" He snatched the wet papers, but in his haste to save the blueprints, he dropped the letter. It fluttered to the floor, landing face up by her feet. For a fraction of a second, Alara's eyes locked onto it. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, a stark contrast to Kane's brute force. She saw a postmark, faded, but she could make out the letter St. Lou. And beneath it, a single, heart-wrenching phrase written in a slightly smudged script. "Forgive me, Silas." "Get out of my sight," Kane snarled, snatching the letter from the floor and stuffing it back into his pocket, his face a mask of fury and shame. Alara scrambled back, murmuring apologies, and fled to the relative safety of the kitchen. She leaned against the cool stone wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She hadn't just found a clue, she had touched the source of his wound. That night, when she recounted the event to Maeve in the quiet of their small room, the nature of their fight shifted. They were no longer just fighting a tyrant. They were fighting a man haunted by a past he couldn't escape, a man whose professional desperation was tangled up in a private sorrow. And that made him infinitely more predictable and dangerously more vulnerable. The air in the cramped linen closet was thick with the scent of lye soap and damp cotton, a small, private world away from the saloon's clamor. Moonlight sliced through a grimy window pane, illuminating the dust motes dancing between Alara and Maeve. They sat on overturned buckets, their voices hushed whispers that barely disturbed the quiet. "Unstable shale," Maeve repeated, her brow furrowed in the dim light. That's the word they used. One of the blasters, a man named Henderson, was 3 sheets to the wind. Said Kane is pushing them too fast, cutting corners to make up for lost time. He said one wrong move and the whole tunnel entrance could come down on their heads. Alara nodded, absorbing the information. It was a powerful weapon. Fear was more potent than whiskey, and if the men feared for their lives, their loyalty to Kane would crumble. "That's good, Maeve. That's something we can use." A word here, a concerned question there, let the men's own fear do the work. "It's a slow burn," Maeve cautioned, her practical nature tempering Alara's rising hope. "Dangerous. If Kane traces the talk back to us." "He won't," Alara insisted, her gaze intense. "But the shale is only half of it. The letter, that's where his heart is. The pressure from his investors is one thing, but the woman from St. Louis, that's his soul. We find out who she is, what happened between them, and we find the lever to break him entirely." Maeve looked doubtful. "And how do we do that, Alara? Ask him to read it to us over a game of cards." "It's a ghost. The tunnel is real." Before Alara could reply, a commotion from the street outside cut through their secret conference. It wasn't the usual drunken brawl or the sound of a departing wagon. It was the distinct, crisp sound of a fine carriage clattering to a halt directly in front of the gilded cage. Such vehicles were a rarity in Redemption Creek, reserved for banking officials or wealthy landowners, none of whom had business at their establishment. They exchanged a look of alarm and crept towards the main room, peering through a crack in the storeroom door. The few remaining patrons had fallen silent, turning towards the entrance. Bartholomew, the owner, was wiping the bar with a nervous energy. The saloon doors swung open, and a man stepped inside who seemed to belong to a different world. He was tall and slender, dressed in a tailored city suit, his boots polished to a mirror shine despite the dusty street. He carried a leather briefcase and surveyed the room with a cool, appraising gaze that missed nothing. Silas Kane emerged from his back room, his stride losing a fraction of its usual arrogant swagger. Elara saw it instantly, the slight tightening of his jaw, the forced affability in his smile as he approached the newcomer. "Mr. Finch," Kane said, his voice a low rumble that didn't quite mask his tension. "An unexpected pleasure. We weren't expecting an audit for another month." The man, Finch, offered a thin, humorless smile. "The investors in St. Louis are growing impatient, Kane. They prefer progress reports in person when schedules slip. I'm here to see what's causing the delay and to ensure their investment is stable." The word stable hung in the air, charged with unspoken meaning. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. St. Louis, the investors. It was all connected, the professional pressure and the personal wound. This man, Mr. Finch, was the embodiment of everything Kane feared. Kane's face was a mask of strained composure as he led Finch toward a private table. From their hiding spot, Elara caught Maeve's eye. The doubt was gone, replaced by a dawning, fierce understanding. Their ghost had just been given a name and a face. Their opportunity hadn't just knocked, it had walked right through the front door, smelling of money and influence. The slow burn had just been doused with kerosene. The air in the gilded cage was thick enough to taste, a bitter brew of stale whiskey, sweat, and a new, palpable anxiety. Mr. Finch's presence had changed the saloon's entire dynamic. He sat with Silas Kane at the foreman's usual corner table, a still, gray hawk observing a cornered badger. Finch nursed a single glass of whiskey, his movements economical and precise, while Kane gestured broadly, his voice a little too loud, a little too jovial. It was a performance, and a poor one at that. Every man in the room, from the railroad workers to Bartholomew behind the bar, felt the shift in power. Elara moved through the room with a practiced grace, her tray a shield and her smile a mask. Across the floor, Maeve caught her eye, a flicker of a nod passing between them. The plan was no plan at all. It was a prayer for an opportunity, a gamble on a single moment of weakness. Approaching Finch directly was impossible. Kane guarded him like a treasure chest, his paranoia radiating in waves. They had to wait for a crack in his armor. Carrying a fresh bottle, Elara approached their table. "More whiskey, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice calm and even. "Keep it coming, girl," Kane grunted, not looking at her. His focus was entirely on Finch. "As I was saying, Mr. Finch, the men are a bit superstitious. This ground is different, but nothing my crew can't handle. A few more charges, a bit more grit, and we'll be through the mountain ahead of schedule." Finch took a slow sip, his gaze unwavering. "Grit doesn't hold up a ceiling, Mr. Kane. My investors are concerned with results, yes, but they are more concerned with catastrophic failure. I've seen the preliminary geological reports. They mention unstable shale and recommend a significant increase in timber supports." Kane's face tightened, a flush creeping up his thick neck. "Reports can be wrong. You have to be out there, feel the rock yourself. These pencil pushers back east don't understand the reality of it." Elara's hands were steady as she poured, but her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the very weakness they'd discovered. As she set the bottle down, her gaze met Finch's for a fraction of a second. She saw no judgment, only a cool, unnerving intelligence. He saw her, not just as a server, but as a piece on the board. Her chance came unexpectedly. A loud crash from the other side of the room, followed by shouts, made everyone turn. Two railroad men, fueled by cheap liquor and simmering resentment, were shoving each other. It was the perfect distraction. Eager to assert his dominance in front of his superior, Kane shot to his feet. "I'll handle this," he snarled, striding toward the commotion. He had left his flank completely exposed. Finch remained seated, his back to Alara, watching the scene with mild disinterest. It was now or never. Alara moved to the table as if to clear Kane's empty glass. She leaned in close to Finch, her voice a low, urgent whisper that wouldn't carry. "Sir," she murmured, her words quick and precise. "It's not superstition. The men are terrified. They hear the mountain groaning at night. They talk of the rotten rock and say the timbers splinter as soon as they're set. They're good men, but they fear they're digging their own graves." She didn't mention Kane. She didn't have to. She was simply reporting the truth of the camp's morale, a truth Kane was desperately trying to hide. Finch didn't turn. His eyes remained on the scuffle across the room. For a terrifying moment, Alara thought he hadn't heard her, or worse, had ignored her. She straightened up, her hand closing around the empty glass, her mind racing. Had she just signed her own death warrant? But then, his voice came, as quiet as hers had been. "Thank you for your concern for the men's welfare." It was a dismissal and an acknowledgement all in one. As Kane returned to the table, his face puffed with self-importance after breaking up the fight, Alara was already melting back into the chaos of the saloon. She retreated to the bar, her body trembling with adrenaline. She watched as Finch looked at Kane, his expression unchanged, yet somehow the quality of his stare was different. It was colder, sharper, more assessing. The seeds of doubt had been planted in fertile ground. The game had irrevocably changed, and Silas Kane, for all his bluster, had no idea he was already beginning to lose. The air in Redemption Creek the next morning was thin and sharp, charged with an unspoken anticipation. Alara watched from the saloon window as Mr. Finch, his city coat a stark black against the dusty street, walked directly to the tunnel site, pointedly ignoring Silas Kane, who scrambled to catch up. Finch didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He moved with the chilling efficiency of a man who held careers in the palm of his hand. He spoke not to Kane, but to the crew bosses and the grim-faced laborers, his questions concise and his gaze missing nothing. Kane hovered at the edge of the group, his broad shoulders slumped, his authority dissolving like sugar in the rain. That evening, the gilded cage was unnaturally quiet. The railroad men drank with their eyes down, the usual boisterous energy replaced by a heavy, watchful silence. When Finch entered, followed by a defeated-looking Kane, every head turned. Finch didn't take a seat. He stood in the center of the room, a letter held loosely in his hand, his presence commanding the space. "Mr. Kane," Finch began, his voice cutting through the tense quiet, "I have spent the day reviewing your operation. I've read your reports to the board, filled with assurances of progress and stability." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Then I spoke with your men. They tell a different story. A story of collapsing shale, of inadequate bracings, of a disaster waiting to happen. A story of a foreman who values schedules over lives." Kane's face flushed a deep, mottled red. "They're lazy cowards. They don't understand the pressures." "I understand pressure perfectly," Finch interrupted, his tone like ice. "The pressure of investors' money being squandered on a project you have grossly mismanaged. The pressure of knowingly endangering dozens of men through negligence. That is the pressure I care about." Desperation clawed at Kane's composure. He looked wildly around the room, seeking an ally and finding none. His gaze fell on Alara, and for a second, a flash of understanding and pure hatred crossed his face. This is your doing." He then turned back to Finch, his voice cracking. "A man is under immense strain out here. Far from civilization, from comfort, from understanding women, there are personal matters, burdens a man like you wouldn't comprehend. Eleonora, she understands what a man sacrifices." The name dropped into the silence like a stone. Alara saw Finch's expression shift from professional disdain to something colder, more personal. He held up the letter he was carrying. Alara recognized the elegant script immediately. "Eleonora?" Finch asked softly, the question a death sentence. "You mean Eleonora Vance, my wife's sister, the wife of Mr. Alastair Vance, the primary investor in this entire railroad line?" A collective gasp went through the saloon. Kane stared, his mouth agape, the color draining from his face. He had not only failed professionally, He had just publicly confessed to a catastrophic personal indiscretion with the one woman who could ensure his utter ruin. The professional failure was a firing offense. This was a scandal that would follow him forever. Finch folded the letter and tucked it into his coat. "You are relieved of your duties, Mr. Kane. A security detail will ensure you are on the first train east in the morning. Your final pay will be wired to St. Louis, minus expenses for the necessary safety refit of the tunnel." Kane didn't speak. He simply stood there, a hollowed-out version of the tyrant who had ruled the town. He stumbled out of the saloon, no one meeting his eyes. The moment the doors swung shut behind him, the tension broke. A low cheer started among some of the railroad men, growing into a wave of relieved conversation. Later, as the saloon hummed with a lighter, freer energy, Alara found Maeve by the back stairs. They didn't need to say anything. They watched the room, a world transformed. Lily was chatting with another girl, a genuine, unguarded smile on her face. The threat wasn't gone forever. Men like Kane would always exist, but the shadow that had suffocated them had lifted. They had faced a monster not with weapons, but with whispers, courage, and a shared secret. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like a closing door, but like an open track, stretching out into the uncertain dawn.